Okay, hello. My name is Jason Ashley. I'm head teacher of Redbridge Community School in Southampton. I've been the head teacher here for 10 years. In terms of the context, the school serves a deprived area of Southampton, is in the top 10% of the most deprived areas in the country. We have about 56% of our students are pupil premium, 45 currently taking a free school meal, although pandemic that's slightly increased. Special educational needs about 25 to 30%. Obviously there's some variation there, but I absolutely love my school. One of the main vehicles of teaching and learning we use within the school is a strategy called guided learning, and that allows the teacher to identify small groups within a lesson that they work with, maybe 4 students. They would normally sit around a table and they would be coached around an area of, say, English that they were kind of struggling with, while the other students would be working independently. And the idea being with that strategy is, over the period of a sequence of 2 or 3 lessons, the teacher would work quite intimately with all students. In light of COVID, that's not been possible. And that has had an impact on some of the quality, if you like, of lesson delivery. It's been much more leading from the front, teaching direct from the front, which is not a bad strategy, you know, when you're looking at things like modelling. However, we know as practitioners having a balance works really, really well. Some teachers have said they found the social distancing in the classroom quite difficult. Particularly when teachers are giving things like verbal feedback, which, you know, a quick verbal feedback is very, very useful in a classroom setting. It's had to be much more written feedback, and we know that written feedback has a much more positive impact in some respects on young learners. However, that has had a disproportionate impact on teachers in terms of their workload. So they're trying to find this balance between what a teacher can do in a normal lesson. We did volunteer for a pilot inspection with Ofsted. They wanted to see if they could inspect during the pandemic to see if they could make accurate judgments and gather enough evidence. I had worked as an Ofsted inspector for, I think it's 3 years, so kind of welcomed it. And they were very, very upfront and honest that the only way they could really observe lessons was from the doorway. So when you kind of think about senior managers and their role in terms of looking at quality assurance, it's made it much, much harder to go into lessons in the way and observe formally in the way that you would do, even with its middle leaders going into their own subjects. With respect to practical lessons, obviously there's been quite a serious curtailment of that. You know, partly because any equipment that is being used has to be sanitized or left for 72 hours. We've got the world's biggest collection of antibacterial, antiviral wipes, so everything gets wiped down. So we try to maintain an element that we will do practical subjects. I think that's really important for students to be able to have that hands-on kind of opportunity, but it means that they can't be as frequent as they normally are. So you couldn't leave almost like a science experiment set for the next year group to use, because they would have to be sanitized. And in a department of 10 science teachers and 2 technicians, there's quite a big impact on that. PE can be slightly different because you can rotate the equipment. Obviously, social distance, not so much of an issue when you're outside. So we know that there was a permission, if you like, from organisations that they could play football, have outdoor training, clubs, activities. So we reintroduced sports and clubs and activities after the second big lockdown, if you like, from the one in March. And finally, what I would say, well, this is a bit of a positive and a negative, the quite significant reliance on blended learning. And what I mean by that is teachers in the old traditional ways, using, you know, books and modelling on the board, to what happens when students are self-isolating. And what we've said is if they're self-isolating at Redbridge, then the teacher is required to deliver a Zoom lesson. That's to prevent them falling behind, partly because on entry students come in with lower than average reading ages. So we felt that rather than just setting work on Google Classroom, we felt that our students had an entitlement to at least some sort of live teaching. But that does invariably put additional pressures on teachers, because you may have 15 students in a class that you're physically teaching, and then you may have 10 to 15 students at home being taught over Zoom. And then finally, on this section, I would talk about current teaching and learning. I would say about professional development. Again, it depends on how you look at the pandemic. We've tried to see it as an opportunity to reflect on our practice and to reflect on what we do. But actually, teachers' professional development has been less during the pandemic for lots of obvious reasons. Firstly, because we can't meet as a staff, or they can't work in small groups, because we try and keep our departments separate as their own bubbles. But the positive in that is we've moved a significant amount of our CPD online, and probably like many schools, we use Google Classroom and Google Drive. So a lot of that kind of CPD, I think, has been very positive, and some of it we're probably going to look to kind of keep, as a reference point. It's okay, isn't it, on inset day when you're standing up talking for an hour in your presentation, how many people are really listening to that? Where actually you can put more pertinent stuff on Google Drive. So overall, I would say we've worked really hard to try and deliver teach and learn as best we possibly can. But that has had significant curtailments in the things that we would normally do pre-pandemic. And hopefully once the restrictions are lifted, we can kind of go back to our key strategy of guided learning. So this time last year, obviously schools were closed, and we spent a lot of time planning for September. And one of the things I wanted to avoid was students in classrooms and teachers going to their lessons. Redbridge has really good facilities, actually. It's something I believe is the head at Redbridge, is our students should have the very best facilities. And as a consequence of that, I felt that it would almost be outrageous, if you like, that they wouldn't be going to have a science lesson in their science classroom, a history lesson in their history lesson. So we developed something called the muster system, and we've got 5 specific zones around the school that holds a year group. So the sports hall would hold year 7, the main hall would hold year 8, a couple of marquees, outside areas, the gym. So each year group would, when they arrive in the morning on a staggered nature, they would go to their muster area. They would have the register taken in their tutor groups, and then they would be released, if you like, to go to the next lesson. And what that would mean is the senior management team have worked exceptionally hard, myself included, in the corridors with walkie-talkies. And when year 7 are released, what we could guarantee was that no year 7 would cross year 8 in the corridor. So they would be able to go to the normal timetabled lessons. So what that's allowed us to do is to really offer our full curriculum. That if you have a timetable of English period 1, you would go to English. Then what would happen is each period would have its own staggered times that the teachers would then release the students. So year 7 would move on to the next class, year 8 would move on to the next class, etc., etc. And that's worked really well. And to try and reduce the frequency of that, we introduced double lessons in nearly all subjects as far as we possibly could. So if you're listening to that saying, well, how can you guarantee year 7's not going to cross in a single lesson? By doing double lessons, what that allowed us to do was the students would do the double lessons, but they would be released and they would go back to their muster, which would then take them into break time or lunch time. And then most single lessons would take place after lunch. So at Redbridge, the structure of the school day is 5 one-hour lessons. You would have period 1 and 2 as a double, period 3 as a standalone, period 4 and 5 as a double. So the middle lesson, if you like, is back-ended by first break and lunch break. And that's actually worked really well. We also wanted to be in a position that we could offer some sort of continuity on the curriculum. But if the instruction that came from the DFE that bubble should go, it's almost like we could go back much more easily. It's not, I had heard stories where some schools, if it was right for their context, would have students housed in a classroom for the day, and the teachers would be expected to go to them. I personally am not a fan of that method. I think it will only get you so far, which is why we introduced the muster system. In terms of some of the curriculum issues that we've had, obviously I spoke in the last section about the impact on practical subjects, particularly PE, science, art, particularly at GCSE, where actually there is a component of practical nature. Was some of our members of staff who are pregnant, who were instructed to self-isolate those with underlying health conditions. And what that actually meant was that we didn't shut down that lesson. The teacher was required, as long as they were well enough, if they were unwell, then we didn't obviously expect them to do that. They would Zoom into the class. So we would be asking teachers to go and supervise, not cover, because they weren't running the lesson, but just to be in the room and working. And that would vary amongst schools. You know, nobody would have known pre-pandemic who would have had an underlying health condition where they needed to self-isolate. So that's had its challenges. And at this present time at Redbridge, we've been hit more severely on this wave than probably the previous two, partly because Southampton had escaped quite lightly. It had an impact on COVID, but it escaped quite lightly on the first and the second kind of wave. The third wave's kind of disproportionately hit Southampton. So we're feeling it at the moment. And just while I'm talking about curriculum modifications, it's not quite curriculum, but it is important, is the impact on safeguarding and pastoral. We have tried to maintain the PSHE curriculum, which we've delivered as whole year groups. So we've still done assemblies. At Redbridge, we have whole year group assemblies for an hour timetable during the day. We do have a camera in there, so we take photographs. Whenever we then have to send any students home, we know roughly who's been within the 2 meters. That's worked particularly well. But where pastoral's concerned, you know, our attendance has remained above the new national average regarding the pandemic. But, you know, there's some students that we had battled to get into school pre-pandemic, which is much, much harder now. It's almost like we've lost them to the system. And there's going to be some kind of ongoing concerns and issues where, you know, where that is concerned. So what I would say is, you know, the pastoral element of schools, I've talked a lot more, less about teaching in the curriculum and much more about the culture. I would say after being the head here for 10 years, the culture is really, really important. And that is based on our values of aspiration, respect, opportunity, and excellence. And we use our pastoral systems assemblies to drive that culture. So one of my biggest concerns was less about learning. You know, I do subscribe to the view that Ofsted have, that learning is sticky, and we offer a very rich knowledge curriculum at Redbridge. So once you learn something, you want to learn more. So the way I kind of thought about it in my mind, learning is a bit like if you haven't ridden a bike for a long time, you don't forget how to ride a bike. It may be a bit more of a challenge, you may ache a little bit more, but the more you do it, the more you get used to it. So that frequency of that learning would help. Pastoral slightly different, and that does kind of concern me, I think, moving forward. On one level, because we've been able to offer a relatively normal curriculum, probably less so than if we were asking specialist teachers to go to non-specialist rooms. We did in September test students using Midius as a bit like a type of SATs, if you like, sorry, CATs. And what I actually found was the year 7 who came in and the year 8 had been disproportionately impacted, partly because the year 8s had missed a lot of year 7 when they were year 7 the year before, and the year 7s that had come in September had obviously not had to do their SATs, and it was much, much harder, I think, for primary schools to be able to drive that. So when we actually looked at the evidence, it was for all year groups, maths had been disproportionately impacted on, less so than the kind of literacy and the language. We're a bit puzzled by that. And we really had to sit down and have a good think. And it was actually really quite obvious. The reason is that all the way through lockdown, when we were asking students to work, effectively, they were using their literacy, their language, their vocabulary, rather than other subjects and how they linked to mathematics. So that meant that we've put in quite a significant recovery plan for mathematics. However, mathematicians will always say, again, maths, you can get really good at it really quickly by practicing the frequency, those kind of things. And the other impact was actually on reading. The reading ages we'd seen for year groups that had been established in the school had actually gone back between 3 and 6 months. So, you know, when you think that students already come into Redbridge below the national average, and their reading is lower than the national average, all that progress we'd actually made for some of the more senior year groups from 9, 10 and 11, actually seeing it go back was quite a big concern, if I'm honest. And we're still doing regular kind of catch up and enrichment work. I'm not going to simply say that I think it's all about money. It's not all about money, whilst money is always good in schools. I would actually talk about systemic issues, the first one being performance measures. I am starting to pick up in the system that there is this desire, if you like, with those people who maybe weren't on the front line of education. And I'm talking, you know, maybe civil servants at the DFE, that they just want to pick up the baton, the relay baton, as though nothing's happened. And that kind of concerns me. You know, I think some of the issues we now have are in the system. And if you are in reception during the first year, there will be an impact on you, but over the period of statutory education, that will become less and less. If you are a year 5, a year 6, a year 7, I think it's probably going to be quite hard, and probably less as you're going through. So my concern is, if we're going back to punitive performance measures where inappropriate judgments are made between schools without factoring in the context and the impact of the pandemic, and it may not necessarily be purely based on things like disadvantaged. You know, I'm aware of some high performing schools that have been decimated by COVID, you know, bizarrely, just, you know, other schools around that area less so, but they seem to have been hit for whatever reason. There needs to be a much more intelligent response about how performance measures work. The second part I would say around that is Ofqual, and actually working with the profession. We know that education is highly politicized, but I would kind of like to add for the record that when we went into a full lockdown this time last year, there was no Ofsted, there was no performance measures, but actually what you saw was every school rising to the challenge, feeding their community, doing welfare checks, dealing with emails, supporting families, key workers coming into school. You saw the very, very best of our profession. And I really would not want to see that goodwill lost so quickly. From my perspective, we got a really good working relationship with FareShare. On the way to work, I was going to Macro buying sacks of potatoes and onions to get out into the community, you know, healthy food, because furlough and unemployment disproportionately affected our community. So, you know, quangos like Ofqual have to accept that whilst there is this real desire at the moment to get back to some sort of normality, the COVID issues will be in the system for quite a few years, and there needs to be a much more intelligent response. Do I think testing is important? Yeah, I do, 100%. You know, it's an academic curriculum that has transformed Redbridge, but an academic curriculum isn't right for everybody. And what academia our students have missed at Redbridge may be completely different to the topics and the academia that's been missed at another school. Because if you're, so for example, we offer a 3-year Key Stage 4. So there's some certainty about what we do and how we can use our enrichment. But my worry is, if you've got departments around the country that start on different subjects, so my background's history, let's say we were looking at the Plains Indians in North America, but another school decides to do medicine through time, but they've missed it in lots of different ways, then how do you kind of account for that in an exam? So you've got 2 students in 2 different schools, one who's an expert on the Plains Indians and the American West, and you've got one on medicine, but the exam board choose to put one in rather than the other. So there has to be a little bit more kind of logic, and then also the kind of social impact on students. So I think there needs to be an ongoing conversation between Ofqual and the profession about what is acceptable. It's almost like we're having a bit of a tapered response, that over a period of years we go back to what it was pre-pandemic. And the third one's Ofsted. Now, this may not sound very popular, but I am a fan of Ofsted. I think Ofsted over recent years have been right to focus on the essence of teaching and the quality of the curriculum. And the pilot I thoroughly enjoyed. We got a lot out of it as a school. It doesn't affect our grading. Lots of stuff to kind of chew and mull over. But I did feel, and I did feed back to the lead inspector, that even during the inspection, it was almost like some of Her Majesty's inspectors have forgot about pandemic. So as a really good example, we did this the second week the first week after the Easter break. So students only been back for 3 weeks. And one of the comments about a year 7 class, we haven't written much. There's not much in their books. And it's like, yeah, because they've been at home since January and they've only just come in. So even though we were still kind of like in a formal kind of lockdown nationally, there was this view where we hadn't kind of thought about it. And but in fairness to Ofsted, they did ask for feedback. You know, what are the things we need to be aware of? And it's almost like they just need to ask different questions. What was your school like before the pandemic? What is your school like now? Pretty much like the questions we're answering now. You know, what have you had to curtail? What looks different? Because what would have worked really well is if we'd done guided learning and you saw a teacher sat in the middle of the room with 4 or 5 students being coached about how to do their work and modeling. That would look really good, but obviously we've not been able to do that. So you couldn't get a true sense of what life was like at Redbridge. The other thing as well that I just want to kind of challenge, I don't always think more is best. This whole idea of extending the school day, I think is a slight misnomer. I don't know of any secondary school or primary school that once they finish at 3 o'clock, pack up and go home. Often students are back through enrichment or intervention programs. Often students are back after school for clubs, trips and activities. And if the school day is being extended because it looks good politically, the danger you will then have is the unintended consequence where actually, if people are forced to do it, why would my head of drama want to put a show on? You know, which is one of the best things we can do as a school to showcase how brilliant our students are. Why would he put all that additional time in over the weekend when he's being told he's got to work till 5 o'clock? School holidays. The other issue about that makes me chuckle is teachers are not paid for their holidays. They are paid for 1,265 hours per year, prorated over 195 days. First of all, they're going to have to find the money to do that. Would the profession be against, a 2-week October half term? Probably not. But here becomes the problem. If you work, so in Hampshire, you've got Southampton, and you've got Portsmouth. Southampton and Portsmouth are actually part of Hampshire, but they are their own individual authorities. If you decided that one authority was going to have a 2-week half term and one authority decided to stay 1 week, then that creates childcare issues for teachers. And we've only just got to the point where we are getting more and more people coming into the profession. So there needs to be some political dialogue regarding extending the school day and more importantly about lengthening the holidays, I wish, shortening the school holidays. Because one thing I would argue, I think most schools are probably running a summer school for 2 or 3 weeks this year. And I think that's the right method to do that. As long as you've got the right students and members of staff don't feel obliged to do it, but they want to do it and they're being paid to do it, then I think that's a really good thing. But likewise, extending the school day, I don't think anybody would have an issue with an extra half an hour. But with some of the research we've done with our parents, they're really quite anti it. For lots of different reasons. One of the main ones being that some of them do have childcare issues and some of them do go on to outside clubs. So fingers crossed, the pandemic doesn't become something that we look back on as thank goodness that's over, we now need to carry on like nothing's happened, but rather thank goodness that's over, and we now need to understand that within the education system, that underperformance, that disengagement that's been caused by it is still there, and it will be there for the next 4 to 5 years. And we have to be a bit smarter about how we challenge that underperformance with the 3 areas that I've outlined today.